The battered pickup, its reinforced suspension groaning under the weight of its cargo, slowly clawed its way over the last few yards of the treacherous forest road, carving deep ruts into the moist, dark earth. Alex Riley, a former operator from the unit known only as 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta Force, gripped the steering wheel, his gaze meticulously scanning the dense thickets framing the narrow passage. Finally, through a solid wall of pine and fir, a dilapidated, long-abandoned hunting cabin emerged, the destination of his long journey deep into the Idaho mountains. The pickup's engine died and silence descended, broken only by the distant whisper of wind in the treetops and his own measured breathing. Alex didn't rush to get out. For several minutes he sat motionless, his eyes methodically scanning the surrounding area, noting every detail, every shadow that might conceal a threat. Then he smoothly opened the door and stepped silently onto the earth, his boots sinking softly into a layer of fallen pine needles. His first order of business was a thorough sweep of the perimeter. Moving in a wide arc around the cabin, he carefully examined the ground for signs of wildlife, or more importantly, the presence of other humans, poachers perhaps, or lost hikers. He checked bushes and the bases of trees for improvised explosive devices or tripwires, an old habit, ingrained deep from years of service in hot zones. The cabin's interior also underwent scrupulous inspection. Every corner, every crevice, the attic, and the crawl space were checked for hidden dangers. Satisfied it was secure, Alex began setting up a temporary shelter, which he designated Alpha Base. He established primitive but effective early warning systems. Thin fishing lines, stretched ankle-high between trees and tied to empty tin cans filled with small pebbles. A few battery-operated, motion-activated mini-sirens were fixed to the approaches to the cabin, carefully camouflaged with leaves. Next came the unloading of the pickup and the organization of his supplies. Army MREs, meals, ready to eat, were neatly stacked in one corner of the cabin. Nearby, he placed cases of high-protein canned goods, tuna, chicken, beans, Sawyer water filters, several large jerry cans of potable water, and an extensive supply of ammunition for each of his weapons were positioned for quick access. His arsenal was small but carefully selected. His trusty M4 carbine with an advanced combat optical gun sight, ACRG, and a surefire tactical flashlight mounted underneath, a G19 pistol with a Trijicon ruggedized miniature reflex, RMR sight secured in a thigh holster, and an R700 rifle with powerful loopholed M4 optics for long-range shooting, a K-bar combat knife sheathed on his belt, and a Leatherman multi-tool in his pocket completed his loadout. Reveille the next morning, as always, was at precisely 4:30, long before the first hint of dawn. This military habit had stayed with him, an unshakable internal chronometer. Intense physical training followed immediately, a series of push-ups on hardened, calloused knuckles, deep squats with a heavy rucksack filled with river stones, pull-ups on a thick, sturdy branch of an old oak growing nearby. After that came the meticulous cleaning of his weapons. Every part of the M4, G19, and R700 was disassembled, wiped down, and lubricated with a focus bordering on meditative. Each movement of his hands was honed by years of daily practice, precise and confident. Breakfast was simple but nutritious, strong black coffee, brewed in a French press, and a portion of oatmeal with a handful of dried berries. Then, Alex spread a detailed topographical map of the area on the rough-hewn table. He studied it for a long time, planning routes for hunting, reconnaissance, and patrolling the secure perimeter he'd established. A radius of several miles around the cabin. An inner voice quietly critiqued his actions. Even here, in this remote corner of the wilderness, in seeming seclusion, he couldn't shake the ingrained security protocols, the constant, unyielding vigilance, the sense of perpetual combat readiness. Venturing into the woods a little later, as the first rays of sunlight began to pierce the dense canopy, Alex moved with the silence of a ghost. His objective was to hunt deer or other game, but primarily it was reconnaissance and threat assessment. He instinctively used the folds of the terrain, deep shadows and natural cover, constantly maintaining a 360-degree field of awareness. His attention was riveted to the minutest details, imperceptible to an ordinary person. A freshly broken branch at a height inconsistent with a large animal. Matted grass with an unnatural bend to its stems. The slightest shifts in wind direction and strength. The sense of the forest, which he analyzed with the precision of a chemical sensor. He was not merely a hunter in the traditional sense. He was an operator assessing new, potentially hostile territory. Suddenly, the sharp, piercing cry of an unfamiliar bird, startlingly close, triggered a vivid, painful memory. The fiery hell of the Karengal Valley in Afghanistan. A short but intensely violent tableau of fierce combat flashed before his mind's eye. The deafening crack and whiz of bullets flying dangerously close. The dry, sharp pops of enemy fire. The distinctive thumps of RPG-7S launching their deadly payloads. The desperate cries of wounded comrades. The acrid stench of superheated metal, gunpowder, fresh blood, and burning human flesh. The agonizing scene of losing his best friend, a sergeant with whom he'd endured countless trials, dying in his arms from a sniper's bullet, pierced him anew. Alex clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breathing hitched, becoming shallow and rapid. He fought against a sudden, unheralded onslaught of acute post-traumatic stress. For a few moments, the forest around him became as suffocating, hostile, and fraught with lethal danger as those cursed Afghan mountains. After a while, having regained some composure, Alex discovered fresh elk tracks. He didn't rush. Crouching, he meticulously studied the hoof prints in the damp earth, the depth of each track, the distance between them, the angle of the hoof placement. From these signs he determined the animal's age, sex, approximate weight, and precise direction of travel. His extensive hunting experience, acquired since childhood, was overlaid with the specialized tracking skills learned in Army CRE, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape school, and honed during numerous counter-terrorism operations across the globe. He pulled out his map and a pencil, marking the elk's bedding areas, trails to water sources, and potential ambush or observation points. Towards evening, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, the forest around the cabin fell still. An unnatural, oppressive silence descended, one that Alex, with his veteran's heightened hearing accustomed to the constant din of battle, recognized as a clear sign of threat, the quiet before the storm. The birds had suddenly fallen silent, their usual chirping gone. Small woodland creatures like squirrels and chipmunks, which had been scurrying lively through the trees that morning, had also vanished, returning to his shelter, Alex stumbled upon several freshly mauled carcasses of small animals: rabbits, squirrels, a raccoon. The nature of the wounds on their bodies was atypical for any local predators he knew, such as bears, bobcats, or coyotes. There was too much gratuitous violence in these injuries. Chunks of flesh were literally ripped out, not neatly consumed, indicating a senseless ferocity, a blind, uncontrolled rage in the attacker. Returning to the cabin in the rapidly gathering dusk, Alex sensed an unseen, heavy presence. It wasn't just the feeling of an animal watching him. This was something different, sentient, something that tracked him with cold, calculating attention. He stopped abruptly several times, spinning around instantly, scanning the woods with his pulsar thermal imager. But each time the screen showed only the cooling trunks of trees and rocks. He detected nothing living, large enough to cause such a feeling. He checked his primitive tripwires around the cabin. All were in place, undisturbed. But the acute, almost physical sense of unease, a chill that ran down his spine, wouldn't leave him. He decided he would sleep in snatches that night, fully clothed, M4 in hand, and his G19, loaded and ready, on his thigh. The silence of the forest no longer felt peaceful. The night was restless. Alex barely closed his eyes. His hearing, sharpened to its utmost limit, caught the slightest sounds beyond the thin cabin walls. Every snap of a dry twig under some unseen weight, every distant rustle in the undergrowth made him tense instantly, his hand instinctively going to the cold steel of his M4. Several times he heard a strange, low-frequency sound, a guttural growl perhaps, or heavy, ragged breathing drifting from somewhere deep in the forest, yet distinct enough to leave an unpleasant taste in his mouth. With the very first rays of dawn as the eastern sky began to lighten, Alex left the cabin and commenced a thorough inspection of the perimeter. And almost immediately he found something that made his heart pound. Circling the cabin in the soft, damp earth left by the night's mist were enormous, deep tracks. They resembled neither bear nor wolf nor any other animal he knew. Each print showed 5 distinct toes, ending in incredibly long, sharp claws that had gouged deep furrows in the soil. The diameter of a single track exceeded the size of his own size 12 combat boot. Alex methodically began to study the evidence. He took out his ruggedized smartphone and snapped several photos of the tracks from different angles, documenting their size and characteristic details. Then, he retrieved a measuring tape from his rucksack and carefully measured the length, width, and depth of each print, as well as the distance between them, meticulously recording all data in his field notebook. On the bark of several thick pines growing near the cabin, he discovered deep scratches running upwards, nearly 10 feet from the ground. These marks looked as if they had been left by enormous blades or claws of a creature possessing incredible physical strength. Alex carefully collected soil samples from several tracks in plastic bags. He also found a few tufts of dark, coarse, almost bristle-like fur snagged on sharp branches of a bush near the tracks. This fur, by touch and appearance, did not resemble that of any local animals he knew. Back in the cabin, he tried to find some information online using his satellite modem. The connection was extremely unstable and slow, but he managed to send a few search queries. Giant tracks, Idaho. Unknown predator, Idaho mountains. Creature 5 toes claws. However, the search results were disappointing. mostly links to local Bigfoot legends or dubious forums which he immediately dismissed as folklore. After a brief analysis of the collected data, Alex decided to conduct a more thorough reconnaissance of the area, moving in the direction from which the creature had come the previous night and where the clearest tracks led. He took his M4, binoculars with a built-in rangefinder, a compass, and his map. His movement tactic was based on the bounding overwatch principle. He moved from one convenient observation point to another, carefully scanning the terrain ahead and to his flanks. His primary goal was to find a lair, trails, or other signs of this unknown and clearly dangerous creature's activity. As he advanced, he noted broken branches at great heights, uprooted young trees, and felled trunks, all evidence of the immense power of whatever had passed through. After several miles of arduous trekking, having navigated dense thickets and rocky scree, Alex stumbled upon a gruesome scene. It was a deep, inaccessible ravine, hidden from prying eyes by dense brush and overhanging cliffs. At the bottom of the ravine, he discovered a multitude of bones from various animals: deer, wild boar, the remains of a small bear cub. The bones were piled in several peculiar chaotic mounds. Some were meticulously gnawed clean. Others were simply snapped in half, as if bitten through by incredibly powerful jaws. On the trunks of several old trees growing along the edges of the ravine, Alex noticed strange, crudely carved symbols. They resembled primitive runes or pictograms, and were clearly not of natural origin. This discovery further intensified his suspicion that he was dealing not merely with an abnormally large or scientifically unknown predator, but with something far more complex and sinister. The grim picture revealed in the ravine, piles of bones and mysterious symbols, triggered a dark memory of an operation in the Balkans. His team had been tasked with finding a missing Allied reconnaissance group. After a long search, they found their bodies in a similar secluded spot, a deep gorge. The soldiers had been brutally mauled, and around their remains, unknown partisans or mercenaries had left similar ritualistic signs carved into the trees. A feeling of déjà vu and a soul-chilling cold, unrelated to the air temperature, ran down Alex's spine. He realized with absolute clarity that underestimating this adversary, whoever or whatever it was, would be a fatal mistake. Returning to the cabin well into the evening, Alex remembered that during his initial inspection, he had found an old, time-yellowed map of the region in one of the desk drawers, dated to the early 20th century, along with several dusty books on local history and folklore. Brewing himself some strong coffee, he began to meticulously study these artifacts, hoping to find clues that might shed light on what was happening. In one of the books, dedicated to local legends and tales of the first settlers, he found several mentions of wolfmen or forest spirits, whom the Native American tribes and early European colonists both feared and revered. He dismissed most of these stories as mystical and implausible. However, the description of some creatures from these legends, their enormous height, incredible strength, sharp claws, and ability to walk on two legs, disturbingly matched what he had seen and his growing suspicions. The next night, Alex decided not to stay in the cabin but to set up a camouflaged observation post in a tall tree, about 200 yards from his shelter. He chose an old, sprawling fir tree that offered a good view of the clearing in front of the cabin and a section of the forest. Using his thermal imager, he prepared for a long and tense vigil. Deep in the night, when the moon hid behind clouds and the forest was plunged into complete darkness, he detected movement. A huge, indistinct silhouette, moving on two legs but hunched like a beast, slowly prowled the edge of the woods, circling the cabin in a wide arc. The creature stood 8 or 9 feet tall. It paused for a moment, raised its massive head to the sky, and let out a long, blood-curdling howl. This howl, full of primal fury, inexpressible sorrow, and hunger, made Alex's blood run cold. The sound was so powerful and piercing that the very trees seemed to shudder. Now Alex was absolutely certain this was no animal in the ordinary sense of the word. This was something else, something far more dangerous and incomprehensible. After the night's observation and that soul-chilling howl, which still echoed in his ears, Alex Riley made a firm decision. He would actively hunt this creature. Passive waiting, defensive posturing, the constant tension and fear of the unknown. It wasn't his style, not in his warrior nature. He clearly understood. This thing was a mortal threat not only to him, but to anyone who might stumble into these woods. He had to deal with it, neutralize it, or it would eventually get him, and then the outcome would be sealed. He meticulously prepared his gear for a long and dangerous pursuit. His reliable R700 with its scope would be his primary weapon. The M4, light and maneuverable, was for close quarters backup. He packed ample ammunition for both, an individual first aid kit, IFAK, several canteens of water, and a day's worth of rations, high-calorie energy bars and jerky. The hunt began with the first signs of dawn, as morning mist still clung to the ground and the air was crisp and cool. Alex moved along the tracks the creature had left the previous night, enormous clear prints in the damp soil. He employed all his extensive experience and skills acquired over years in special operations. He moved against the wind, so his scent wouldn't reach the keen senses of his quarry. His ghillie suit, covered in tufts of grass, moss, and small twigs, blended perfectly with the surrounding forest vegetation, making him practically invisible beyond a few dozen yards. To further mask his scent, he rubbed exposed skin with a mixture of earth, crushed pine needles, and wood charcoal. He moved slowly and methodically, his movements fluid and deliberate like a predator stalking its prey. He constantly scanned every bush, every dense shadow, every fallen tree where he expected the creature might be. His R700 was always at the ready, his finger resting on the safety, prepared to disengage it and fire in an instant. He noted every detail along his path. The height of broken branches, the depth of prints on different types of soil, rare tufts of dark fur snagged on thorny bushes, places where the creature had stopped for a brief rest. The trail, distinct and fresh, became increasingly clear, indicating he was gaining on his target. After several hours of tense pursuit, the tracks led Alex to a small, overgrown creek, its water gurgling quietly as it flowed over stones. The terrain here was rugged, with numerous natural hiding spots, fallen trees, dense willow thickets, small gullies. Alex felt the tension mount, every nerve stretched taut. He instinctively knew he was approaching the denouement, the creature's lair or daytime resting place. He mentally reviewed his tactical plan: approach routes to the target, most likely sectors of fire, and safe withdrawal routes in case of unforeseen circumstances. Alex chose an ideal position for observation and ambush. It was a small natural rise on his side of the creek, concealed behind the thick trunk of a hurricane-felled tree. From here he had a good view of the creek itself, the opposite bank densely covered with willows, and several retreat paths if needed. Long, agonizing hours of waiting passed. The sun climbed high, then began its slow descent westward. The silence of the forest, broken only by birdsong and the rustling of leaves, grated on his nerves. Alex recalled numerous combat operations where he and his comrades had lain motionless for days in hides, in ambushes, enduring heat or cold insect bites, in tense anticipation of the target's appearance. Patience and psychological resilience. These were his key qualities, which had saved his life more than once. He drank water in small, economical sips from his canteen and ate an energy bar, trying not to make the slightest unnecessary noise. Suddenly, just as Alex began to doubt his calculations, it emerged from the dense willow thickets on the opposite bank of the creek. A colossal 10-foot bipedal silhouette, covered in coarse, bristly blue-black fur. Its muscular yet disproportionately built body radiated an aura of primal power. Long, incredibly powerful arms ended in huge, sharp claws capable of tearing steel. Its snout was elongated, bestial, with eyes that burned with an unnerving dark amber light, revealing not only blind fury but also glimmers of sinister intelligence. The creature's movements were swift, sharp, predatory, yet possessed a kind of malevolent deliberation and grace. Alex instantly shouldered his R-700, centering the massive torso in his crosshairs. But the creature, possessing uncanny senses, spotted him at the last moment, just as his finger began to squeeze the trigger. It let out a deafening, furious roar and, with astonishing speed and agility, launched itself into an attack, leaping across the creek in wide, powerful bounds. Alex managed to instinctively dive aside, evading the direct line of attack, just as he'd been taught in countless close-quarters battle CQB drills for engaging numerically or physically superior foes. He tried to re-aim his rifle at the rapidly approaching beast, but it was already too close, its speed incredible. A powerful swipe of a clawed paw aimed at his head knocked him off his feet. Alex only had time to instinctively raise his left forearm to block the blow. Razor-sharp claws tore through the thick fabric of his tactical jacket and bit into his flesh, reaching the bone. Searing, unbearable pain shot through his entire body, momentarily robbing him of the ability to think. Falling backward, losing his balance, Alex, acting on pure, service-honed reflexes, squeezed the trigger of his R-700. The deafening roar of the shot ripped through the forest silence, echoing off the gorge walls. The bullet, designed to take down large game, struck the creature in its left side, just below the ribs, where the spleen or liver would be. A wild, deafening howl, full of inhuman pain and rage, shook the surroundings. The creature recoiled, its swift attack faltering. It froze for a moment, its burning eyes fixed on Alex with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred and a clear recognition and assessment of its opponent's strength. Then, leaving a clearly visible trail of blood on the grass and earth, it spun sharply and, with incredible speed, vanished into the dense forest thicket, retreating away from the creek, back into the depths of the wild, untrodden mountains. Alex, breathing heavily and raggedly, struggled to his feet. The adrenaline surge that had helped him survive the first seconds of the fight began to recede and the pain from the deep wound on his left forearm became unbearable, throbbing and sharp. Blood gushed profusely from the torn tissues, soaking his jacket sleeve and dripping in heavy dark drops onto the ground. He quickly inspected the wound. It was deep, ragged, with uneven edges. Through the blood, he could see damaged muscles and whitish strips of tendons. Without losing a second, he tore his individual first aid kit from his belt, which he always carried, and applied a tight pressure dressing to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. However, blood continued to seep through the bandage. Realizing the seriousness of the situation and the danger of blood loss, he quickly fashioned a makeshift tourniquet from his sturdy belt and a short, strong stick found nearby, applying it above the wound. Then he took a little antiseptic-laced water from a small flask on his belt and copiously rinsed the wound, wincing from the stinging pain. The pain was all-encompassing, sharp. His head swam from weakness and blood loss. Staggering, on the verge of losing consciousness from pain and weakness, bleeding profusely, Alex began his agonizing journey back to the cabin. Each step sent fresh flashes of unbearable pain through his injured arm. He had lost a significant amount of blood, and his strength was rapidly failing him. The forest, which just recently had been an object of his intense study and tactical assessment, now transformed into a hostile, tangled labyrinth full of dangers. He stopped several times, leaning heavily against tree trunks to catch his breath and fight off waves of nausea and encroaching blackness in his vision. He hadn't forgotten to retrieve his R-700, lying on the ground near the site of the struggle. Mechanically, he checked the magazine, one round expended. His shot had found its mark. Finally reaching his cabin, Alex, running on the last vestiges of will and strength, first tried to fortify the entrance. He barricaded it from the inside with old heavy furniture, a table, several chairs, and a couple of thick logs he had prepared earlier for the stove. The windows, empty openings, he hastily boarded up with planks he found in the shed next to the cabin. He was sure the wounded creature, filled with rage and pain, would definitely return to finish what it had started. His years of military experience told him a simple, brutal truth. A wounded enemy is the most dangerous enemy, unpredictable and desperate. After finishing his makeshift fortifications, Alex laid out the remainder of his medical supplies, which he always carried in a special pouch, on the table. It was a small army surgical kit, including a scalpel, several surgical needles, sterile suture material, forceps, and clamps. Beside it, he placed a pack of powerful, broad-spectrum antibiotics and several ampoules of painkiller, tramadol, left over from his old army supplies. Removing the blood-soaked bandage, he once again, more thoroughly, treated the wound. He rinsed it with boiled water mixed with salt, which he used as an antiseptic. Then, clenching his teeth until they ground, he began to remove small fragments of fabric, dirt, and particles of the creature's claws from the wound. The pain was hellish. He was on the verge of losing consciousness several times, but stubbornly continued. After cleaning the wound, he applied several crude but strong sutures to draw the edges of the ragged wound together. He understood. Without this, the wound would take a long time to heal, and the risk of severe infection was enormous. After completing this agonizing self-surgery and taking a large dose of antibiotics, Alex, fighting off growing weakness and dizziness, tried to analyze what had happened. The nature of the wound inflicted by the unknown creature's claws was extremely unusual. It was too deep and ragged for the claws of an ordinary animal, even a large predator. The edges of the wound throbbed. The wound itself felt hotter to the touch than the surrounding undamaged tissue. He noticed with surprise and alarm that minor scratches and abrasions around the main wound, sustained during his fall and struggle, were healing with an unnatural, frightening speed. However, the deep, ragged wound on his forearm looked terrible, inflamed and swollen. The process of self-treatment, the sight of his own blood, and the sensation of pain brought back heavy memories of an injury he had sustained several years ago during an operation in Syria. Then, he had to provide emergency first aid not only to himself but also to a severely wounded comrade while under heavy enemy mortar fire, using a minimal set of medical supplies. That time he had survived only thanks to his composure, professional knowledge, and luck. But now, the situation was completely different. The enemy was unknown, its nature incomprehensible, and the wound he had received carried something more than just physical damage. It was different, sinister, poisoned. Towards evening, Alex's condition deteriorated sharply. He began to suffer from severe chills, periodically alternating with bouts of unbearable fever. His body temperature was rising rapidly. He felt it without a thermometer. The wound on his forearm burned like fire. It was severely swollen and throbbed with such force it felt as if something were moving or growing inside it. He realized with horror that this was not just an ordinary wound infection, which he had encountered many times before. This was something alien, something that had entered his bloodstream along with the dirt from under the creature's claws. A fever set in, engulfing not only his body but also beginning to cloud his mind, causing short, disturbing hallucinations. At night, the fever reached its peak. Alex was tossed between unbearable heat, forcing him to throw off his blanket and drench himself in sweat, and a bone-chilling cold that sent violent shivers through his body. Uncontrollable tremors racked him. His muscles cramped painfully. The skin on his wounded forearm and around it began to darken rapidly, acquiring an unhealthy purplish-blue hue. The wound itself, despite the sutures, continued to throb with a new, tripled intensity, and Alex felt as if he could physically sense the bones in his arm changing shape, deforming, as if someone unseen were twisting them from within. Fragments of information from classified briefings about biological weapons development, about fast-acting viruses capable of causing uncontrolled mutations, surfaced in his inflamed consciousness. The symptoms he was experiencing pointed to an aggressive, unknown infection or a targeted genetic attack. Physical agony was soon compounded by excruciating sensory overload. His hearing sharpened to a painful degree. The creak of old floorboards in the cabin sounded like a deafening cannon shot. The quiet squeak of a mouse scurrying somewhere under the floor resonated in his ears like a piercing shriek. The breath of the wind against the cabin's plank wall became the roar of an approaching storm. His vision also underwent changes. It became incredibly sharp, microscopic. He began to distinguish the minutest details of objects in the almost complete darkness of the room, yet bright light, even from the dim moon filtering through cracks in the boarded-up windows, caused sharp stabbing pain in his eyes. Scents, previously barely perceptible, became unbearably strong, pungent, and distinct. He could smell the damp leaves under the cabin, the scent of raw earth, the smell of his own blood and sweat, all mixing into a nauseating cacophony. Simultaneously, an agonizing, almost uncontrollable hunger set in. But this was not ordinary human hunger. It was a primal, instinctive craving for raw, bloody meat. The mere thought of his canned goods or MREs brought on an immediate wave of nausea and revulsion. Overcoming his weakness, he stumbled to where he kept the remains of the deer he had killed a few days earlier and hadn't fully prepared. He found a piece of raw, still fresh meat, and with a kind of animalistic greed, barely chewing, swallowed it. For a few moments he felt a strange, perverse relief, a wave of warmth spreading through his body. This act, committed almost unconsciously, horrified the part of his consciousness still desperately clinging to the remnants of humanity. Then began the most terrible, most agonizing phase of this incomprehensible transformation, hellish, unbearable pain in the bones throughout his body. His bones elongated, thickened, shattering in dozens of places only to unnaturally re-knit themselves, altering their very structure, their shape, their density. The muscles of his body were seized by brutal, tearing cramps. They tore beneath his skin and regenerated, becoming denser, stronger, coarser than before. He screamed from the unbearable pain, but the sound escaping his parched throat increasingly less resembled a human cry, becoming a low, guttural, bestial snarl. Overcoming a new wave of all-consuming pain, Alex, staggering, managed to reach a cracked mirror he had once propped against the wall in a corner of the cabin. In the dim moonlight filtering through narrow chinks in the boarded-up windows, he saw with indescribable horror how his own face had changed. His features had sharpened, his cheekbones became wider and more massive, his nose coarsened, elongated. He slowly raised his hands and looked at them. The nails on his fingers were thickening, lengthening, sharpening, transforming into short, strong claws. Coarse, dark hair like bristles was sprouting on the skin of his arms, chest, and back. Despite the agony gripping his body and the fog clouding his mind, Alex, clinging to the last vestiges of his analytical thinking, tried to understand what was happening to him from the perspective of his knowledge in medicine and biology. Saliva, or the creature's blood, some unknown retrovirus. Or is it nanotech? Accelerated cellular mutation caused by an unknown biological agent. This isn't mysticism, it's a perverted, out-of-control life form, biology or genetics taken to an absurd extreme. He vaguely recalled classified briefings for special forces units that mentioned potential biological weapon threats, secret government projects to create super soldiers, experiments in genetic engineering. But what was happening went far beyond anything he could have imagined, beyond the wildest and most terrifying assumption. His sense of smell reached an incredible, inhuman acuity. He now picked up myriad scents of the surrounding forest. The smell of damp earth after rain, the aroma of decaying leaves and rotting wood, the subtle scent of resin oozing from pine trunks, and many others previously inaccessible to his perception. And amidst this complex symphony of forest aromas, he suddenly, distinctly, caught the familiar, musky, unpleasantly metallic scent of the creature that had wounded him. He sensed its unseen presence nearby, its hidden malice, its clear intention to return and finish what it had started. And, most terrifyingly and disturbingly, he felt a strange, subconscious sense of kinship or recognition, in that repulsive odor, and with it, an irresistible primal urge tearing him apart from within, not only to kill this beast, to avenge his pain and suffering, but also, incomprehensibly, to join it, to become like it. After a brief period of oblivion, brought on by unbearable pain and exhaustion, Alex struggled back to consciousness. The first thing he saw were his own hands. They had changed, grown larger, rougher, his fingers thicker, and his nails had transformed into short, sharp claws. He ran a hand over his chest and felt coarse, dense fur sprouting through his skin. Cold, clammy panic and all-consuming despair gripped him with renewed force. He realized with horror he was irreversibly transforming into something like the beast that had attacked and wounded him by the creek. The thought of completely losing his human essence, his self, his identity, terrified him far more than any physical pain he had ever experienced, more than the fear of death in battle. Clenching the remnants of his will, Alex desperately tried to fight the escalating transformation. He used all his inner strength, all the mental self-control techniques he had once been taught in special courses for resisting interrogation and torture. Over and over, he mentally repeated his name. Alex Riley, his military rank, recalled the faces of his loved ones, key, significant moments of his past, human life, desperately trying to hold on to these last fragments of his slipping identity. But animal instincts, primal blind rage, and an uncontrollable hunger for raw meat grew with each passing minute, becoming louder, more insistent, gradually drowning out the quiet, weak voice of his reason. In rare moments of relative lucidity, when the waves of pain and bestial fury receded slightly, giving him a brief respite, Alex frantically, with his last strength, searched the old cabin. He hoped to find records, clues left by previous inhabitants of this abandoned place. Those who had faced the same terrible problem, the same curse. Under one of the creaking floorboards in a small recess, he stumbled upon an old leather-bound journal, almost rotted by time and damp. The entries were made in an uneven, trembling hand. The faded ink had bled, making the text illegible. But in the fragments he could decipher, it spoke of a curse of the full moon, of uncontrollable bestial rage seizing soul and body, and of the grievous necessity to pass this terrible burden to another, to find peace. Alex, with a soul-chilling horror, realized his complete, absolute isolation from the outside world. His satellite modem, his only means of communication, he had smashed himself hours ago during one of his violent fits. But even if the modem had worked, who could he tell about what was happening to him? Who would believe him? He would be immediately deemed insane, a danger to society, and they would try to isolate or destroy him. He was trapped in this wilderness, in this diabolical snare, alone with his nightmare, with the beast awakening within him. A crushing sense of utter hopelessness, despair, and loneliness weighed heavily on him, draining his last strength. Memories of the harshest, most grueling stages of the Army's SIRE, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, course surfaced in his inflamed brain. Instructors in those courses simulated capture, lengthy interrogations with physical and psychological abuse, creating incredible pressure on the trainees' psyches. Then, in those training yet extremely realistic conditions, he had learned to endure pain, fear, disorientation, cold, and hunger, while maintaining clarity of mind and the will to resist. He tried to apply these long-forgotten skills now, in this desperate situation, to maintain at least partial control over his mind, over his body. But the current enemy was immeasurably more insidious and dangerous. It was inside him. It was part of him, and that made the struggle impossible, doomed to failure. Through the agony of transformation, through fear and despair, new, strange, and terrifying sensations began to emerge. He felt his body filling with incredible physical strength, surpassing anything he had ever experienced. His reflexes sharpened to their limit. His reaction became lightning fast. His endurance knew no bounds, exceeding any conceivable human capability. He felt his body becoming a more perfect, more efficient instrument. An instrument for survival in the wild or for ruthless hunting. And some deep, primal part of his consciousness, the one that had lain dormant in him all these years, met this new, wild, untamed power with a horrifying, perverse curiosity and even a kind of dark acceptance. This frightened him even more than the pain itself, this barely perceptible yet insistent temptation to succumb to his bestial nature, to let go, to become what he was becoming. At some point, when the pain receded and his mind cleared, Alex made a difficult but only possible decision. He realized he couldn't stop this terrible transformation, couldn't reverse the process. The thought of turning into a mindless, bloodthirsty monster, hunting innocent people or animals, was absolutely unbearable to him. Therefore, he decided, if he couldn't find a way to heal or at least control the beast within, he must do everything possible to ensure that the creature that had infected him, that had condemned him to this torment, was destroyed. And he was prepared to die in this fight, but to die as Alex Riley, soldier man, not as a nameless, soulless monster roaming the woods. Alex Riley, battling waves of pain that crashed over him with increasing intensity and fighting a bestial rage that threatened to consume his consciousness, made his final irrevocable decision to fight. There was nowhere to retreat, and retreat no longer made sense. The curse, or whatever it was, already coursed through his veins, changing his body, his very essence. He was not a victim by nature. He was a soldier, a warrior, and he would fight to the very end, to his last breath. Tactical schemes, plans for defending the cabin, various courses of action for different scenarios, still raced clearly through his mind, despite the fog of his progressing transformation. He resolved to turn this dilapidated, abandoned cabin and the small patch of woods around it into his final fortress, his last stronghold, using every means available, all his combat experience, and the remnants of his human ingenuity. Not one step back. This is my territory. The thought pulsed in his brain, lending him new strength. Using the last of his human strength and an awakening, instinctive animal cunning, he began to methodically set traps around the cabin. He dug deep wolf pits, lining their bottoms with sharpened stakes carved from sturdy branches, and camouflaged them with a thin layer of sod, leaves, and dry grass. He strung thin, almost invisible tripwires of fishing line at ankle height, tying them to clusters of empty tin cans that would rattle loudly when triggered. Some tripwires he connected to signal flares from his emergency kit. Others to makeshift sound grenades he hastily fashioned from empty camp stove fuel canisters and several powerful firecrackers. Recalling lessons on setting booby traps, he also rigged several heavy falling logs, cleverly secured high between trees, ready to crash down on an unwary enemy if a thin support line was cut. He regretted not having the components to create true improvised explosive devices, but he made maximum use of what was at hand. Natural materials, his multi-tool, and his deadly war-honed ingenuity. Alex carefully identified key approaches to the cabin, considering the terrain, vegetation density, and the likely attack routes of the creature, which he had no doubt would soon return. He prepared several primary firing positions inside the cabin, at the single intact but boarded-up window, and at the demolished but now barricaded door. He also prepared 1 or 2 alternate firing positions outside, in natural cover behind thick tree trunks and in small depressions in the ground. He meticulously cleared fields of fire from his positions, removing small bushes and low-hanging branches that would obstruct his aim in poor visibility. He prepared his ammunition. Magazines for the M4 and R700 were loaded with expanding bullets, possessing maximum stopping power. His G19, with several spare, fully loaded magazines, was, as always, secured in its thigh holster, and his K-bar combat knife was on his load-bearing vest, easily accessible. The pain from his progressing transformation and the unhealed wound on his forearm never ceased. But Alex, by sheer force of will, pushed it deep into his consciousness, focusing entirely on the primary task, survival, and the final destruction of the enemy. He employed special breathing techniques and mental visualization methods he had once been taught to control stress and pain in extreme combat situations. Fear, of course, was there. A primal, animalistic fear of the unknown and of his own transformation. But he managed to transform this fear into cold, calculated rage and an unshakable determination to fight to the end. He felt like a cornered wolf, ready to sell his life dearly. Alex not only prepared a passive defense, but also actively tried to mislead his enemy. He created several false trails leading away from the cabin towards particularly dangerous traps or into kill zones that were well covered from his pre-prepared firing positions. He did his best to camouflage the cabin itself, using freshly cut branches, moss, and clumps of earth, so it would blend as seamlessly as possible with the surrounding forest, especially in low-light conditions. Around the cabin, on likely approach paths, he scattered broken glass from found bottles and dry, brittle twigs to hear the slightest rustle of an approaching enemy. Before darkness fell, Alex once more methodically checked all his traps, ensured the reliability of his cover and the readiness of his weapons. Small supplies of water and food, now mostly raw meat, which, succumbing to a growing animal instinct, he had managed to procure by killing an unwary fawn with his bare hands during a fit of uncontrollable bestial hunger. An act that filled the remnants of his human consciousness with deep horror and revulsion, were at hand at his primary firing position by the barricaded window, which offered the best view of the most likely direction of attack. He sat motionless, listening to every sound, his M4 resting on his lap, ready for battle. As darkness enveloped the cabin, the forest around it came alive, but it was not the life he was used to. These were the sinister sounds of an approaching threat. Alex, his senses incredibly heightened by his incipient transformation, clearly heard the creature's heavy, rasping breath, the crackle of dry branches under its heavy paws, a low, guttural growl emanating first from one side, then another. The beast circled the cabin like a wolf around a sheepfold, studying his defenses, searching for weak spots, approaching from different directions. Several times, his distant tin can alarms triggered, their sharp clattering sound making Alex's heart momentarily freeze, then pound even faster. The tension in the cabin reached its breaking point. The air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Alex felt a primal hunter's thrill awaken within him, a hunter who had suddenly become prey, but had no intention of surrendering without a fight. After several long, tense hours of agonizing anticipation, when Alex's nerves were stretched to their limit, the creature finally made its first decisive foray. It wasn't a full-scale assault, but a swift, furious reconnaissance in force, aimed at the weakest point in the cabin's defenses, one of the windows hastily boarded up. Powerful, crushing blows from enormous paws or a shoulder shook the flimsy structure of the cabin. Planks splintered and buckled. Alex, without a moment's hesitation, opened aimed fire with his R-700, targeting the dark silhouette flickering in the pre-dawn gloom beyond the window. He fired 3 quick but accurate shots. The bullets thudded into the wooden logs of the wall near the beast, but several times he distinctly heard the wet smack of impact on living flesh, followed by a short, furious roar of pain. The beast instantly recoiled from the window and retreated back into the saving darkness of the forest to assess its damage and lick its wounds. Alex quickly analyzed its tactics. This was no mindless, blindly attacking animal. The creature acted cautiously, deliberately, and most dangerously. It was learning on the fly, adapting to his actions. The beast quickly changed tactics. Instead of direct assaults, it began to methodically circle the cabin's perimeter, keeping a safe distance yet carefully testing Alex's traps. Sometimes it deliberately triggered them from afar by hurling heavy stones or thick, dry branches. This was an attempt to reveal the layout of his booby traps and force him to expose his position inside the cabin, provoking a premature reaction or shot. Periodically, the creature emitted blood-curdling, drawn-out, mournful howls and low, guttural growls that chilled the blood. This was an attempt to demoralize him, break his will, sow panic. Alex tried not to fall for these provocations. He responded only with short, aimed bursts from his M4, and only when he was absolutely certain of a precise hit, conserving every precious round. The tense, oppressive silence that periodically settled between the creature's attacks, broken only by its eerie howls and growls, vividly reminded Alex of one of his deployments to Afghanistan. Then, during the night defense of a remote, isolated outpost high in the mountains, Taliban fighters had used a similar tactic. They tried to wear down his unit before a dawn assault, using psychological pressure, isolated sniper or RPG attacks, creating constant tension and preventing the soldiers from sleeping. He used this old, hard-won experience to resist the enraged monster's provocations, maintaining his composure and clarity of thought despite the pain and his progressing transformation. Alex actively used his knowledge of the terrain around the cabin, acquired during his previous days of reconnaissance and hunting. Deep shadows from sprawling trees, large boulders, small depressions, and gullies all became part of his defensive tactics, his temporary cover and routes for maneuver. But the beast, too, navigated the night forest perfectly, using it as its natural, familiar sanctuary. It appeared and disappeared silently, like a phantom, materializing first on one side of the cabin, then the other. Alex's senses, sharpened to an extreme by the transformation beginning in his body, helped him anticipate the creature's maneuvers, to detect its approach seconds before an attack. But it still remained incredibly fast, unpredictable, and a mortally dangerous opponent. Realizing that an easy victory over this man trapped in the cabin was not forthcoming, and having sustained several painful wounds from his accurate shots or by stumbling into one of his cunning traps, the creature flew into an even greater blind rage. Its attacks became more frequent, more powerful, and more reckless. It stopped being cautious and began to simply ram the cabin walls, trying to break through with its massive muscular body. The old, dilapidated cabin creaked and groaned under its furious assault. Siding planks flew off one by one, new holes appearing in the walls. During one attack, the creature managed to tear away some of the boards Alex had used to cover a window, creating a breach in the wall. Another time, it managed to trigger one of Alex's falling log traps, but fortunately for Alex, it avoided being crushed, leaping aside just in time. Alex realized his improvised defenses wouldn't last long against such primal, untamed power and blind fury. He constantly changed his position inside the cramped cabin, darting from one piece of cover to another to avoid being caught off guard or cut off from escape routes. Alex had been fighting this unequal battle for several hours since nightfall. His ammunition for the R-700 and M4 was rapidly dwindling with each repelled attack. His own transformation, triggered by the creature's bite, progressed relentlessly, bringing fresh, ever stronger waves of unbearable pain and periodically clouding his consciousness. But simultaneously, it endowed him with superhuman endurance, incredible reaction speed, and animalistic resilience. He watched with a mixture of horror and detached curiosity the changes occurring in his body. He realized soon he would have to face this beast head-on, in a desperate hand-to-hand struggle where his firearms would be useless. The outcome was unpredictable. The critical moment arrived unexpectedly, though Alex had been anticipating it. The creature, enraged to its limit by numerous wounds and futile attempts to reach its prey, concentrated all its incredible power and fury on the cabin's front door. After several deafening, crushing blows from its massive body, which made the entire cabin shudder to its foundations, Alex's improvised barricades of old furniture and logs gave way. With a loud crack, the door splintered into a pile of shards and debris. The enormous, dark, shapeless silhouette of the monster, breathing heavily and emitting a guttural growl, stumbled into the cramped space of the cabin. Alex had no time to think, no room to retreat. He was forced into immediate, deadly close-quarters combat in an extremely confined, debris-strewn space. In the dim, uncertain moonlight barely penetrating through numerous holes in the walls and the shattered doorway, a brutal, primordial battle unfolded. A battle not for life, but to the death. Alex opened fire with his M4 almost point blank, sending bullet after bullet into the massive torso of the advancing monster until the magazine ran dry. He tossed the useless M4 aside and instantly drew his G19 from its thigh holster, continuing to fire at the beast, which seemed completely unfazed by the hits. When the pistol rounds ceased to have any visible effect at such close range, when the pistol ran empty, His trusty K-bar combat knife came into play, followed by the butt of his R700, which he wielded like a heavy club. An unimaginable cacophony filled the small cabin. Furniture shattered under the blows of the combatants. Walls trembled from their impacts and collisions. The monster's furious guttural snarls mingled with Alex's hoarse cries of pain and rage. The air filled with the thick stench of fresh blood, gunpowder, and coarse matted animal fur. Alex, despite his opponent's clearly superior physical strength, desperately employed all his hand-to-hand combat skills and CQB tactics, learned over years. Sharp evasions, hard blocks, rapid movements within the confined space, attempts to strike at the monster's presumed vulnerable points, eyes, throat, groin, which he desperately tried to locate on this shapeless, furious mass of muscle and claws. His own intensifying animal nature, a result of the curse, gave him additional superhuman reaction speed and physical strength. But it wasn't enough to overcome the creature, which was the embodiment of pure primal fury and power, a fully transformed werewolf. In the course of this desperate, furious struggle, both combatants sustained numerous severe injuries. The monster's long, razor-sharp claws tore at Alex's flesh, leaving deep, profusely bleeding gashes on his body. Alex, using his combat knife and fragments of furniture as makeshift weapons, also landed several retaliatory blows. The cabin floor quickly became slick with blood, his own and the dark, thick blood of the monster. The pain from his wounds gradually dulled under the immense adrenaline rush and the all-consuming battle rage that now gripped him as well. At one critical moment in the fight, when the monster pinned him against the cabin wall with incredible force, crushing his chest and robbing him of breath, a brief but vivid memory flashed through Alex's mind. It was a hand-to-hand struggle with a fanatical, crazed insurgent in a dilapidated building somewhere in the ruins of Fallujah, Iraq, years ago. He had survived by a miracle then, thanks to desperate resolve, a last-ditch combat move, and blind luck. This sudden, vivid memory gave him a new, desperate impetus, forcing him to rally his last reserves of strength and fight even more fiercely, more desperately than before. In the very heat of the battle, when Alex's strength was nearly exhausted, when all seemed lost and death inevitable, he miraculously managed to find an opening. The monster, delivering another blow, momentarily lost its balance after a missed attack, its huge paw swiping empty air. Alex, seizing this single, fleeting chance, with the last vestiges of his strength, the last reserves of his will, delivered a desperate strike. It was his Remington hunting knife, which he had left lying on the dilapidated table, and which, in the chaos of the fight, he had miraculously managed to reach with his free hand. He struck not at random, not blindly, but instinctively aiming for his opponent's vital organs, under the ribs towards the heart or lungs, much as he had once been taught in special anatomy courses for swift, silent elimination of enemy sentries. The sharp blade of the hunting knife plunged deep to the hilt into the creature's body. It let out a drawn-out, heart-wrenching, human-toned howl that gradually faded into a gurgling, deathly rattle. Its enormous, massive body began to convulse, muscles rippling under its thick black fur in terminal spasms. To the indescribable surprise and growing horror of the heavily wounded, bleeding Alex, who was barely staying on his feet, watching his enemy's agony, the body of the vanquished monster began to rapidly shrink. the thick black fur covering it retracted, sinking beneath the skin. Its bones reshaped with an unnatural, gruesome cracking sound, audible even over his own ragged breathing. Before Alex, on the blood-soaked, debris-strewn floor of the ruined cabin, writhed in its death throes not a giant, fur-covered monster, but an emaciated, naked man of about 50. His gaunt body was covered in old, long-healed scars of various shapes and sizes, silent witnesses to a long, brutal, and suffering-filled life. Long, tangled, dark hair, wet with sweat and blood, clung to his high, wrinkled forehead. In his wide-open, crazed, but now rapidly fading eyes, there was not only a shadow of horror, but also a strange, serene relief. The man struggled to open his eyes, his cloudy, unfocused gaze momentarily fixing on Alex, who stood over him, breathing heavily and leaning against the wall for support. There was no primal fury in the dying man's eyes, the fury that had burned there just minutes before. Now they held a terrifying, perverse calm and a faint shadow of grim, malevolent amusement. Finally, "I'm free," he rasped, barely audible, coughing up thick dark blood that bubbled on his chapped lips. This curse, it's yours now. Wear it, with dignity, or burn to ash in its grip. He let out a quiet, gurgling chuckle, and his head lolled sideways like a broken doll's. The gruesome smirk frozen on his thin, bloodless lips was simultaneously an expression of long-awaited relief and a sinister omen. The very instant life finally left the tormented body of this unknown stranger, a new, even stronger, all-consuming wave of unbearable pain shot through Alex. This pain was so intense, it eclipsed all his previous wounds from the brutal fight, forcing him to double over and emit an inhuman groan. His numerous bleeding wounds were healing with incredible visible speed. The skin on them smoked, pulsed, and regenerated before his eyes, leaving not even scars behind. But simultaneously, his body fractured anew. Bones throughout his frame cracked and began to restructure with horrifying, unnatural rapidity. Muscles bulged, swelling with some new, inhuman strength. His figure began to rapidly change. Alex's human consciousness, his personality, his I, began to rapidly fade, sinking into a crimson, bloody fog of primal, uncontrollable rage and awakening animal instincts. He vaguely felt thick, dark, coarse fur rapidly growing on his body, on his arms, chest, and back. His face elongated, deformed, transforming into a coarse, bestial muzzle. His teeth lengthened, sharpened, becoming razor-sharp fangs capable of tearing living flesh. His arms and legs deformed, the bones within them elongating and thickening, turning into powerful muscular paws with strong, non-retractable claws, adapted for running and hunting. Losing the last vestiges of his human self-awareness, driven now solely by ancient, deeply ingrained animal instinct, the newborn beast that Alex Riley had become stumbled awkwardly out of the ruined, blood-soaked cabin. He moved on all fours, his new, unfamiliar limbs clumsy, yet he covered ground with surprising speed. He instinctively headed for the creek. The same creek where, just days before, he had ambushed his predecessor, the previous bearer of this curse, and where he himself had received that fateful, life-altering wound. The cold, clear water of the creek into which he plunged his burning muzzle brought him slightly to his senses, but not back to human reason. The bright, cold light of the full moon, hanging high in the night sky, reflected vividly in the calm, dark water of the creek, as if in a mirror. Alex, or what he had now become, slowly raised his head and looked at his reflection. In the water, he saw not himself, not Alex Riley, soldier, veteran, man. He saw an enormous, mighty, fur-covered creature, a werewolf. Dark, blue-black thick fur covered its entire massive, muscular body. Its eyes burned in the darkness with an inhuman, predatory amber fire. From its snarling maw, full of dagger-sharp fangs from which thick saliva slowly dripped, escaped a low, guttural growl. Animal primal horror, mixed with inexpressible despair and an all-consuming blind bestial rage, overwhelmed his new, still unformed consciousness. He was the new bearer of the curse. Soldier, hunter of men and monsters, he himself had now become a monster. The hunter had become the hunted, and now a new, even more dangerous and unpredictable predator, king of this dark, wild forest. He slowly raised his heavy bestial head to the moon shining in the sky, and let out a long, mournful howl. This howl, full of unbearable pain, primal sorrow, untamed fury, and a new terrifying, wild freedom, echoed powerfully, resoundingly, through the night-stilled, fear-stricken Idaho forest. The curse had been passed. The beast was born.